So it's been recognised, I guess, in the past decade or two in particular, that education is a setting where LGBTQ plus people really encounter quite a lot of structural and discursive levels of discrimination. They suffer from things like a lack of representation in school curricula and in textbooks and other kinds of teaching materials as well. So this is something that has been looked at by big global organisations such as ILGA World, who also find as a result of this that a lot of young LGBTQ plus people are particularly at risk of social exclusion in education and all of the associated detrimental effects that come along with social exclusion, such as drop in attainment, mental health issues. This area of discrimination and inequality has also been recognised by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. They did a big study back in 2013 to find that hate crime and discrimination against LGBTQ plus people were particularly prevalent in many of the EU member states. They found that amongst LGBTQ identified youth, there was a great fear of being out, of disclosing sexual orientation and or gender identity at school. And a lot of young people across the EU member states recalled being on the receiving end of negative comments and bullying based on their sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation. Similar findings were found by UNESCO, again on a global level, who found that there was fairly widespread violence and bullying against LGBTQ plus students in educational settings, and called for all countries really to try to do more to try and create a safe and more inclusive learning environment for all students. And importantly, they identified this as a kind of a fundamental human right as well. Nobody should feel unsafe in education, and if they do, that can be perceived as to be some sort of breach of a human right. So that's kind of the very broad context. Some researchers within linguistics have obviously been taking a close look at the situation as well. So quite a lot of our colleagues in South America, who I'm working with at the moment, actually on some of these related projects, have identified moral panics really regarding gender and sexuality diversity that have particular pertinence to school contexts. So they found this, despite legislative changes, which seem to be making progress towards gender and sexual diversity and equality, actually what seems to be happening in schools is the opposite. There is increased discrimination, increased homophobia, transphobia, and so on. One of the reasons they give for this is that a lot of educational policies which are progressive and focus on inclusivity in the curriculum have actually been attacked by the religious conservative right in recent years. Obviously, that's an issue in some global contexts more than others, but we are seeing it in places like Brazil, the United States. We're seeing it to a lesser extent, but it is still very much there here in the UK, and I know in a number of countries across Europe as well. So writers such as Fabricio and Moita Lopez then argue that what we're seeing is a renewed, what they call heterosexualization of school spaces. So we're not necessarily seeing the overt homophobia that we may have seen in the past, but we're seeing schools become increasingly heterosexualized through the institutionalization of particular norms regarding gender and sexuality. And I would add that this includes particular norms around language practices that relate to gender and sexuality, which I'm going to talk about today. So if we get to some of the research then, like I said on the previous slides, despite a lot of recent legislative changes around the world that have actually worked towards LGBTQ plus equality, things like same-sex marriage, and extending adoption rights to same-sex couples and so on. A lot of the academic research is finding that heteronormativity and homophobia still continue to pervade schools. And obviously the effects of this are really damaging on young people who either identify or who are perceived to identify as LGBT. So there's a number of quite large scale studies in the references there that have all found those similar characteristics in schools. And what I've been arguing in my work in recent years is that one of the reasons that we haven't really changed things in schools just yet is that we don't still fully understand how it is that heteronormativity and homophobia get enacted in school contexts. And we think we know that one of the key ways that homophobia happens is actually through language and the way that language is used in particular ways within particular school contexts. In the data that I present a little bit later on, interestingly, this is one of the critiques of work that's emerged in previous years. We don't really find that there's very much overt homophobic language happening. So that's kind of led to a bit of a critique, really, of some of the earlier work that focuses almost exclusively on trying to challenge homophobia in schools. Language works in much more subtle ways than that. And what I find in my data, and other researchers do as well, is that it's less the case that language is explicitly homophobic and more the case that language produces heteronormativity, often in quite subtle ways. So in the later slides of this presentation, they're a bit data heavy, but I'm going to hopefully be talking through a few examples that show where and how that happens through language. So schools are interesting places for a number of reasons. One of them are that they tend to be a little bit at odds with the rest of society when it comes to gender and sexuality. So there's quite a lot of progress being made in the UK, for example, and in other countries towards LGBTQ+ inclusion in many areas of society, with attitudes becoming increasingly accepting, increasingly positive. But actually schools seem to be a little bit behind with that. So I'm kind of interested in using linguistic analysis to try to explore some of those dissonances and some of those tensions. And why it is that there's almost like a time lag between what happens in the rest of society and what happens in schools. So this has been pointed out by a number of people. Kjaren and Johansson, for example, observed that LGBTQ+ visibility, legal rights and positive social attitudes are often really strong outside school contexts, obviously in some countries more than others. But things seem to change inside the space of the school. And it's here that there is still this overriding heterosexist assumption that everyone is straight and should be straight. And anyone who deviates from that expectation, that expectation of a social norm, the effects are going to be quite negative socially. And just at the top of this slide, I've included a quotation from one of my research participants, and this is just a short extract from an interview that I did with her, where she really identifies this tension between what happens in school and what happens in the rest of society when it comes to attitudes towards gender and sexual diversity. So she says that LGBT is absolutely everywhere. Like Caitlyn Jenner was the most tweeted about thing of the decade when that whole story came out. So it is literally in everyone's pockets, literally, you know, accessible on a cell phone in your pocket, yet no one is talking about it. And here she is specifically talking about the school context. So schools are weird. Schools are unusual, actually, when it comes to gender and sexual diversity and people's attitudes towards them. And language is clearly a part of that. So these are the kinds of questions I've been interested in researching in recent years. So how are attitudes towards gender and sexual diversity enacted in the texts and language practices that circulate in schools? And what can linguistic analysis reveal about gender and sexuality discourses? and the way that they operate in the school context. So I'm going to be exploring some aspects of these questions throughout the rest of this talk. For this talk, I'm mainly going to be drawing on research that was published in this book, Language, Sexuality and Education. This was kind of the culmination of a few years of research that I've been doing, looking at different aspects of school and using different kinds of linguistic analytical frameworks, all trying to explore the way that gender and sexual diversity is perceived and experienced in UK school contexts. So I looked at different kinds of data within this project. So I looked at transcripts of classroom interaction. I conducted interviews with young people and with educators as well. And I analysed school curriculum documents. And then I used different analytical frameworks. So for example, for some of the analysis, I used corpus-based critical discourse analysis. I used Buchholz and Hall's tactics of intersubjectivity framework, which is a kind of sociolinguistic framework for looking at language and identity. And then I used elements of appraisal analysis, so looking at the language of evaluation and how that is used to construct identity in school context. Now, obviously, I don't have enough time to talk about all of this data and all of these different kinds of analyses today. So I'm just going to focus today on the classroom interaction data that I worked with. And I'm going to focus specifically on the way that I analysed that, mainly using critical discourse analysis, but with some elements of corpus linguistics drawn into that as well. There are other publications where I kind of pick up on some of the other data sets and types of analysis in a little bit more detail, but it's kind of all drawn together in this book here anyway. So the classroom interaction data, as it says here then, was drawn from relationships and sex education lessons. So it might perhaps be useful to provide a little bit of context on relationships and sex education as it is in England at the moment, because I obviously don't expect everybody to have knowledge of this. So RSE, as it's known, provision is actually devolved in the UK at the moment. So the schools where I did my research were in England. And within RSE, it's actually kind of split across the curriculum subjects of science and another subject called personal, social and health education, PSHE for short. So the science element of RSE covers things like puberty, human reproduction, menstruation, STIs and things like that. Whereas the PSHE element it's supposed to cover the more social and emotional aspects of relationships and sex education. But some of the topics that are covered are things like STIs, abortion, and really the emotional effects of that, the nature of marriage and the importance of family, bringing up children, different types of relationships, features of positive and stable relationships, and the benefits and risks of different lifestyle choices. I am using the language that's in the RSE guidance here, so these aren't my particular choices of phrases here. So I was interested in, my recordings came from the PSHE aspect of relationships and sex education in 2 schools in England. So what gets covered is actually not written down in a particular curriculum document, but there is guidance that's issued to teachers who teach this subject within PSHE. So the most recent guidance was actually just published it was published in 2019, and it started to be implemented in 2020 following a 2-year review period. So we do actually have fairly up-to-date RSE guidance that teachers use to guide their teaching of RSE now. The guidance was revised following quite a lot of heavy criticism of the preceding version, and a lot of people were lobbying for changes so that the guidance incorporated relevant legal changes in the UK, such as the Same-Sex Marriage Act that was passed in 2013 and the Equality Act that was passed in 2020. Prior to this, the guidance had not been updated at all since the year 2000. There was another review in 2014, but nothing really changed after that, strangely. So these changes, this new guidance was long overdue. Now, the good news about the most recent guidance is that it does include LGBTQ plus inclusion. So there's a section on diverse relationships and identities. The bad news is it's only in a really, really small section. So there are only 2 paragraphs in the whole document, which is about 30 pages long. And actually the language used in those particular paragraphs is really quite vague. And what that means is that the implementation of the guidance is likely to be quite variable by teachers. It's very open to interpretation. And in the analysis that I'm going to talk through in the next part of the presentation, we'll see that a lot of the language used by teachers is kind of skewed towards the older version of the guidance, which didn't really include the stuff on LGBT plus inclusion like it does now. And because the language is quite vague in the guidance, it's probably likely that this is going to continue in the future unless there's some sort of further intervention. So that's something to maybe think about and come back to talk about at the end. So there are a number of problems that have been found if we look at the literature that's researched relationships and sex education in England. A lot of young people themselves say that they switch off from it because it's very de-eroticized is a term that comes up quite a lot in the literature. So it's simply not perceived as something that's interesting or particularly useful for young people. The research reports a conflict very often between the relatively de-eroticized content of RSE and their own experiences of relationships, again, outside school. There's a difference here. So when relationships and sex are represented in other areas of life, such as magazines, TV and music, they're done in quite often quite a positive way, not always. But certainly they can be eroticized, they can be represented as desirable, as fun, as people wanting to engage in them for positive reasons, and that's very very different, as we'll see when we look at research. Actually want to know about this subject. Research with young people suggests that they don't really see the content of RSE as reflecting their actual lived experiences. This is obviously a problem because people need to be engaging with learning materials in order to get something from it. So this leads me then to the kind of research questions that were guiding my language-focused research when I was looking at RSE lessons. So I was interested in what kinds of gender and sexual identities are constructed in RSE, how are gender and sexual identities constructed interactionally in the lessons that I examined. And then I was also interested in potential silence and absence. So what language was missing, as well as what language was actually there in these interactions, and what does that also tell us about constructions of gender, sexuality and sexual subjecthood in this particular area of school curriculum delivery. And obviously my interest was in focusing on language to answer all of these questions. So this is just a kind of snapshot of the data that I worked with then. So I recorded a number of RSE lessons in their entirety, transcribed them all, obviously, and then analyse the interaction that was taking place. All of the lessons took place in year 9, which in England, the students are aged between 13 and 14. And actually, this was RSE in its pretty much in its entirety. So students in year 9 really only get like 3 or 4 lessons per year on RSE. It really doesn't go very much beyond that. So the input that they get is actually fairly minimal, which in itself is a problem. Okay, which we can again maybe also come back to talk about towards the end. And as I said earlier, I mainly used critical discourse analysis to analyse the interactional data, but I drew a little bit on some elements of corpus linguistics as well. So as people like Paul Baker have termed this corpus-based critical discourse analysis. One of the advantages, obviously, of corpus linguistics is it allows you to analyse larger amounts of data and to explore patterns in language use which are not necessarily observable to the human eye. So as a discourse analyst, corpus linguistics can be quite useful for being able to identify discourses, or what Baker refers to as the cumulative effects of language. Linguistic features build up in their patterns of usage. And these kinds of build-ups in patterns produce particular kinds of discourses across the data set that is comprising the corpus under scrutiny. So this kind of approach was quite helpful, because what it did was it enabled me to identify some key patterns of gender and sexuality representation in the RSE classroom interaction texts. And that was particularly helpful for revealing key discourses and key ideologies, which obviously is really what I was interested in doing. So I'm going to move on to looking at some of the data now. I'm going to start with actually some of the corpus analysis. There's then going to be more of the critical discourse analysis after that. But first of all, I did a keyword analysis. So I put all of the texts into the Wordsmith Tools program, and then I constructed a keyword list by comparing them with the British National Corpus word frequency list. And I'll just give everybody a second to have a look at the table of the top 20 keywords that emerged from all of the classroom interaction data. So keywords these are the words that are the most marked, or the most salient, so the most meaningful in the corpus that's under scrutiny. The words that have an asterisk are lemmas, by the way. So girl here includes girl, but it also includes girls and girling and so on, girlfriend. Okay, I also removed the grammatical words just because they're not very interesting for this sort of project. So these are basically the lexical keywords here. They give us quite a useful overview, really, a starting point for what were the main themes really that were emerging from these RSE lessons. So, I mean, I thought when I looked at these, there's a lot of emphasis on the physical, biological aspects. So we've got, you know, penis, genital, kind of biological body parts named here. What that also suggests to me is that gender actually is getting reduced to or conflated with biological sex. So this is actually about biology, even though it's supposed to be. The PSHE part of RSE actually it's very much getting conflated with the biology part that's supposed to be taught over in the science curriculum. We can see that girls have a higher keenness than boys here. That tells us that actually girls are mentioned a lot more in the lessons than boys are. We'll get into that a bit more in a second, but that in itself is quite an interesting finding, really. And then there's a bit of a focus on illness disease, STIs, we've got warts, gonorrhea, lovely things like that. Okay, so it's not kind of selling it in a particularly positive way. There's a lot of emphasis here on obviously negative effects, I guess, of engaging in sexual activity. Now, it's a small corpus, you know, in corpus linguistics, this will be classed as a very small corpus. So we maybe shouldn't read too much into this, but interestingly, these findings do actually support a lot of other research findings that also find these thematic priorities in the teaching of RSE. Like I said, in the research questions, I was also interested in what wasn't there, you know, so what does not get represented through language? What are the noticeable absences that are revealed through that keyword analysis? Well, I noticed straight away there was nothing about things like consent, love, pleasure, emotions, or anything really to do with the social dimensions of sexuality. Nothing about equality, respect, and nothing about gender identity and sexual identity or diversity, you know, and these are kind of key issues really that a lot of young people say that they want to learn about in RSE, but certainly in the lessons I looked at, these aspects simply weren't there. Okay, and then I looked at some concordances. So I picked out some of these words or words that seemed to me to be particularly interesting to look at in the corpus, and looked at some of the semantic patterns that appeared in the concordance line. So this one is for girl. Again, I'll just pause for a few seconds to let people have a quick read of that, quick skim over. Okay, so it's potentially quite interesting to look at in terms of how girls get constructed in the interaction in these lessons. Things I noticed are that girl collocates a little bit with words like little and young on the left here. They also could co-occur a couple of times with boys as well. So girls and boys kind of occur as binomials in some of the concordances here. There's also reporting of statistics as well. You know, a quarter of, loads of, and things like that. And then some of the processes that occur over to the right are things like talking, but also sleeping around actually was the bigger context there. And actually a lot of the processes that girls are appearing in these concordance lines are actually quite negative, and suggest that girls don't have a lot of agency, actually. They're also, I mean, if you look at it, it's quite de-eroticized, quite de-romanticized as well. None of these patterns seem to indicate anything, particularly about emotions and feelings. So it kind of suggests initially perhaps quite a dehumanizing discourse of gender and sexuality for girls. Now, boys, remember, don't feature as much as a keyword as girls do, but obviously they are mentioned in the lessons quite a bit. So again, I'll just pause for a few seconds to let people have a look at these concordance lines. So unlike girls, boys can be boyfriends here. So they are sometimes indicated to be in a relationship through the use of the word boyfriends. There's one reference here to the possibility of boys being in a non-heterosexual relationship. You know, they're gay. If there's more boys, they're gay. We'll come back to that. I'll be showing a more contextualized extract that features that line a little bit later on. And some of the processes seem to give boys a little bit more agency than girls, and construct boys as perhaps a little bit more active as well. Okay, so we've got things like have had sex, put condoms on, ran, putting pressure on. So, you know, an initial glance seems to suggest perhaps that girls and boys are being constructed a little bit differently in terms of things like expected sexual agency and responsibilities for certain kinds of behaviours and sexual activities. The final concordance I looked at was for sex. Again, this is a lemma, so it includes a variants of the word sex, like sexual, sexually, and so on. And a lot of these concordances seem to show that sex is disease. Unprotected also occurs a few times. And this shows that sexual activity is mainly being talked about in these lessons in relation to risk and negative outcomes. And actually sex is for a large part being constructed as something that's quite dangerous, quite risky to get involved in. So, you know, I think some of the corpus analysis can be quite helpful for pointing towards things that might be of interest and might be of significance to how gender and sexuality identities are getting constructed in this particular set of lessons here. If we kind of start to build in more of a critical discourse analysis by looking at longer extracts rather than just concordance lines, we might be able to look in a little bit more detail about how some of those discourses are being constructed. So I'm going to do that just over the next few slides. Apologies in advance that, like I said at the beginning, this part of the talk is quite data heavy, but actually it kind of brings the research to life a little bit. So I always prefer to put lots of data in rather than lots of theory in. You can ask me about the theory at the end. That's fine if you want to. So a lot of the time in these lessons, when I looked at the transcripts in their entirety, along with that corpus analysis, it seemed to be that gender was being constructed in very binary terms, which may not be surprising for a lot of people to hear. And as I've said already, there seemed to be a real conflation of gender and biological sex. Gender was being presented as if it was exactly the same thing as biological sex, particularly when physicality was being discussed. There was no acknowledgement, no mention at all of transgender identities. Okay, so in some of these examples here, you get this is what a thrush discharge would look like for a girl. Well, actually, if it's a transgender girl, it may look very different from what the teacher is presenting in this lesson here. Interestingly, references to male genitals were much more prevalent than female ones. There were no references, again, probably not surprised to hear, to the clitoris or female orgasm or any sort of pleasure, actually, that may be derived from having a female body. So gender is binary. Gender and sex are pretty much being presented as the same thing, which we know is really problematic because it excludes a lot of gender identities and experiences that may be and are actually relevant to young people at this age, and particularly in this context. There's also a discourse of compulsory heterosexuality. So in support of the research that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, heteronormativity is something that is very much being upheld and reinforced through the language that's used by the teacher. And this happens in quite subtle ways. You know, she doesn't explicitly say things like, you know, you have to be heterosexual. It's more often realized through things like these examples, where the teacher says it can be something as simple as your mum or dad have found condoms in your bedroom, you know, and mum and dad is a kind of heterosexual construction there that implicitly assumes that everybody is going to be part of a heterosexual nuclear family. Clearly that's not the case, but those other possibilities of family structures are actually occluded through this kind of language use. So it's not overtly hostile, but it does render certain kinds of identities and relationships invisible and really marginalizes them. Similarly, when the teacher's talking about hypothetical relationships, there tends to be an implicit assumption that it's going to involve a male and a female, boy and a girl. Again, the gender and sex terms are conflated. And there are a couple of examples here where we can see that the teacher is kind of putting, implying that any kind of relationship is going to be heterosexual without explicitly saying, you know, this is the norm. Okay, there's also a discourse, like I've said again, of heterosexual activity being risky. You know, sex is not represented in these lessons as something which is pleasurable, is fun, is even that desirable, really. There is a big discourse of risk and of sex happening mainly for negative reasons. Girls especially are presented as being, as always, full of regret for engaging in any kind of sexual activity. And there's a big emphasis upon negative consequences, so things like STIs, possibly even resulting infertility from that, unwanted pregnancy, being judged negatively by peers. So that there are sex is definitely presented with a big kind of warning sign, discursive warning sign around it in these particular lessons. There are just a couple more examples of this on the next slide. Apologies that there's quite a lot of text here. It's just quite an extended example here that the teacher gives of an instance where a girl got involved, started having sexual activity with a boy, and ended up getting gonorrhea. So it's a very kind of negative story, and functioned really within that discursive context as a warning to girls who are in that particular lesson. And again, here's just another example where the teacher is very much talking about negative reasons for young people wanting to engage in sex. There's a very much a marginalization of the idea of sexual activity taking place because of positive reasons, like love and, you know, wanting intimacy, wanting to explore different kinds of relationships given the age of these young people. And the overriding feeling that's presented for engaging in sex at this age is a negative one. It's one of regret. Okay, so there's a lot of negative emotional talk going here, like low self-esteem, lacking in confidence, etc. So that was a kind of another discursive theme that emerged from the data. And here's just a similar example, really. This time, the girl that the teacher is talking about is reported as engaging in sex because of pressure, because she felt pressured to do so, not because she kind of wanted to. Okay. And again, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on the negative consequences of that. There's the possibility of unwanted pregnancy, the possibility of STIs, and ultimately the feelings that were experienced as a result of that were reported as being very, very negative. I also found that there was another discourse, again, kind of related to the gender construction of gender as binary, but girls were actually very much represented as having responsibility for the negative outcomes of sexual activity. They were the ones who were presented as having to do something about it if something had gone wrong, having to go for emergency contraception, for example, having to think about the potential consequences of that. And even though there's just one example provided here, it was actually a theme that ran throughout the whole of the data set. There were a number of examples, again, that are cited in the book. So it's all kind of quite negative, really, the analysis so far. There were a couple of examples, though, more positively. where there was mention of sexual diversity. So even though predominantly the discourse was around compulsory heterosexuality, and we've seen examples where the language is very much upholding heteronormativity, there were a couple of times where this was actually challenged in the interaction. Interestingly, these instances were initiated by students in the class, not by the teacher. So in this example here, a student-initiated contribution introduced the possibility of gay identities into the lesson. So here they've basically got some statistics up on the screen in the classroom, which shows that well, a third of boys report being sexually active by the age of 16. And a quarter of girls, and some of the students here can't figure that out. They can't figure out why the statistics aren't the same for girls and boys. You know, why is it that more boys are reporting being sexually active by the age of 16? And one of them suggests, well, maybe some of them are gay. Maybe you're assuming that they're sleeping with each other. You know, boys sleeping with girls. But actually, if some of the boys are sleeping with other boys, then that would mean the statistics are higher. It's perfectly sensible, logical suggestion that's being made here. And actually, you know, I was in the lesson observing it, and it was made as a sort of serious, sensible suggestion. It wasn't a sort of, you know, homophobic, trying to be funny, trying to provoke a kind of response there. So a kind of possibility for sexual diversity was introduced into the lesson at this point. The teacher was fine with that. The teacher does not close it down, does not respond negatively, and is actually quite positive. However, this is not really pursued as a topic, and I thought that when I was observing, this was a little bit of a lost opportunity, that maybe there could have been a bit of a discussion around sexual diversity at this point, given that the students themselves had raised it. But actually they just kind of went back to I guess whatever was on the lesson plan, which was a little bit of a shame. And then in this is the final example. The student-initiated contribution in this case was really, I thought, challenging dominant gender different discourses. So the student here says, don't you think they were being a bit unfair? That group of kids that talked about it, they were saying the guy should do it, but it should be the girl as well. Okay, so they're talking about who has responsibility for initiating a relationship, for initiating a sexual relationship. And the girl is challenging the implication that had clearly been shown on the video that they're talking about, that it should be, you know, a boy that actually has responsibility for that. And a number of the other students joined in just after this as well. And there was a little bit of an interesting discussion about, you know, how girls always get constructed as passive, boys always get constructed as the initiators of sexual activity. And that's not necessarily right. The students were really kind of challenging that. And again, the teacher was fine with that. The teacher was responded to that very positively, but it wasn't a topic that ended up being as developed as it perhaps could have been. And you know, again, it was a bit disappointing. It could have been a really good lesson, I thought, if that had been, you know, the focus of the rest of that lesson. So I'm drawing to a close. I just want to sum up the kind of key findings then so far. So from the corpus-based critical discourse analysis of these examples of classroom interaction, there were a number of discursive absences, first of all. So there were absences around things like consent, love, pleasure, emotions, equality, respect, non-violence, and mostly around gender and sexual diversity as well. There was an emergence of a discourse of gender difference, where boys and girls were presented as kind of different rather than similar. Gender was very much being presented as kind of binary sex. The two were conflated a lot of the time. There was a clear discourse of compulsory heterosexuality. There was a discourse of heterosexual activity being presented as risky and dangerous, particularly for girls. There was a predominant focus upon the negative reasons for engaging in sexual activity. And again, you know, this is all heterosexual activity because other possibilities weren't mentioned. And there was a discursive construction of girls as being responsible for the negative outcomes of sex, a discursive marginalization of gender and sexual diversity. However, there were these occasional resistant or alternative discourses produced by the students, but still within a relatively restricted discursive space. So the findings are all a little bit negative, and that kind of aligns with a lot of other research that's been done in this area previously. However, I did just want to draw attention to the fact that another sort of strand of research in this area is trying to look at things a bit more positively and looking at possibilities for reconstructing schools as queer transformative spaces, you know, looking for opportunities where we might be able to challenge and resist these dominant discourses, which appear to be quite negative and quite damaging a lot of the time. So this is another area of work that I've been engaged in recent years. And actually, if anybody's coming to the workshop later, I'm going to switch the focus more towards this, to looking at challenge, resistance and possibilities for transformation. So if you are coming along to the workshop, those are the kinds of things that I really hope that we can get into a little bit later on. If you're involved in other panels and are therefore not at the workshop, this slide, final slide, really just kind of sums up what some of the possibilities for transformation and change might actually be. So like I said at the beginning, applied linguistics is really all about wanting to change things, wanting to transform things. So these are perhaps some of the ways that we might do that, or certainly things that we could possibly explore in the future. So we might think about the role of language in creating greater inclusion of issues where there are currently discursive absences. We might think about using language to explicitly include a wider range of sexual and gender identities, and to concurrently try to remove those very implicit linguistic references to compulsory heterosexuality that we saw in the data. We might think about using language to challenge essentialized, binary, biological constructions of gender, and to challenge the notion that girls and boys have different characteristics and attitudes towards sex. We might use language to challenge the idea that sex is dangerous, and to recognize and critique gender discourses that position girls, boys, and non-binary identified young people differently. And then we might also think about the role of language in creating responsible education for boys, and to think about how we might use the wider school curriculum to teach all of these issues as well. There are probably more, but I'm going to have to draw this talk to a close. So happy to discuss anything that I've talked about there on that slide or in the rest of the lecture. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this exciting plenary talk. Now we have 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat and I will read it out to Professor Sauntson.
I can see that there are some comments, really interesting comments in the chat. Yeah, no vagina in the top 20 words. Yeah,
I see Dr. Perez. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helen, for this really nice presentation. Really interesting and an applied dimension for linguistics, which is always nice to see how we can change the world in looking at language. I had one question and one specific question and one general question. The very specific question, is about transitive constructions and transitive verbs. I read in a PhD that some sociologists and linguists suggest that sexual relations tend to be encoded by transitive verbs, suggesting a form of action of a masculine subject on towards a more feminine patient. Did you observe a similar constructions in your data?
Yes, I did. Yeah. That was really kind of clear in the data. And again, it kind of surprised me because I thought that, you know, within the context of personal, social and health education, this is a subject that's supposed to be quite dialogic when it's taught in England, in schools in England. But no, it was very much, you know, the boys do this to girls a lot of the time. So yeah, that was interesting, and that was a kind of clear pattern that I observed as well.
Thank you very much. And my more general question was, do you have what are the applications of your research? Are you in contact with, you know, like the ministers to change the way sexual education is taught in schools, or?
I kind of go through the intermediaries. There's a PSHE association in England, which has responsibility for advising ministers on the content of the guidance that goes out to teachers. And then there are kind of activist organisations that lobby the government as well around what to include in schools. So yeah, I basically do share research, and I'm in fairly regular contact with those organisations. We have I'm not sure what I can say on Zoom. I'll say it anyway. You know, we've got quite a conservative government here in the UK at the moment. They're a bit resistant to change. Thanks.
Okay, we have one question in the chat, so I will just read it out. Can you say something about the setting of the school, urban, countryside? I wonder to what extent the findings generalize across factors like culture and age of pupils.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. One of the schools was in an urban area, and the other school was in well, a really kind of small market town. I'd say it's not very rural, but a kind of semi-rural location, both in the north of England. And yeah, there are certainly areas of England where the population of schools is certainly, it's a lot more multi-ethnic, a lot more multicultural, and actually consists of a much greater diversity of both students and teachers as well. In other areas of the research, I did conduct research in schools in other parts of the country, but for the classroom interaction part, it was just 2 schools in the north of England. Obviously, when you're just an individual researcher, there's a limit to how much you can do. And analysing interaction and going in and recording lessons is time consuming. But it would be really fascinating actually to repeat the study in different kinds of schools, and I probably would, I would be really interested actually to see how different teachers in different areas deliver this subject differently.
Any other questions?
Okay, maybe now can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good, because we have some technical difficulties, but thanks so much for your really fascinating talk, and also showing us how school is such an interesting discursive site in the sense of I mean, very complex dynamics when it comes to what you refer to as heterosexualization. So on the one hand, you have students, as you have shown us in the class, clearly resisting, right, certain, you know, discourses being imposed by the teacher, but at the same time kind of doing the heterosexualization, you know, on the premises of the schools. And I guess I'm wondering, because you posed a lot of, in a way, I think in your last slide, it was an agenda for, okay, this is what we need to do, this is where we should be going. And I wondered whether you see actually teachers as agents of change, and, you know, thinking of applied linguistics research, is it something where, you know, our focus should be? So, or is it maybe more, you know, or should it really be in the hands of students, you know, doing this discourse of resistance? You know, I'm just wondering, thinking of the really complex dynamics. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's no single answer to that. Teachers are clearly perceived and constructed as agents of change a lot of the time. In other parts of the research where I was interviewing young people, they clearly see teachers as being really, really influential in terms of kind of making or breaking their school experience to a certain extent. But actually that puts a lot of pressure on teachers who are already under a lot of pressure. And to be honest, I think change should happen at a policy level. I think it really needs to happen at a high level, rather than putting yet another set of responsibilities onto teachers, if that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, young people in schools in the UK are great at making things happen from the ground up, but their voices tend to be quite marginalised. And then they can, again, that can, what they want to do can either be facilitated or it can be closed down, depending on the school environment and how supportive or not the particular teachers might be. So it is really complex, and actually it's really different across schools as well. But I think policy is something that has to be looked at.
Mm-hmm. I hope you can hear. Hope you can hear me.
I can now, yes.
Hear me? Yes. Okay. Just to follow up on what you said. I remember, you know, from the research we did that even though when you have a policy change, so you have documents and guidelines where teachers are clearly instructed what to do, what they actually do in classroom does not really match these sort of expectations and recommendations. So anyway, just I thought I wanted to share. Thanks.
Yeah. But it, you know, like in your research, it can happen the other way around as well. You know, teachers can very much kind of queer the classroom, even if the materials themselves are very kind of heterosexualized. So there are possibilities for change, and individual teachers do it a lot, I think, but it's not kind of systematic. It's not systematic, I think, is probably what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you. We also have time for the last question from Netta. So I will just read it out. Would you say that the change is also needed on the level of teaching training?
Yes, definitely. I think this kind of thing needs to start from the beginning in teacher training. I mean, I'm not sure what it's like in Poland or in other contexts, but in the UK, teacher training is done very, very intensively, just usually over a 1-year period. And everything has to be crammed in to that 1 year. So it's a really, really full curriculum. And what tends to happen is issues of equality and diversity and inclusion are addressed, but they're addressed in, like, you know, they get like a 2-hour session on it. And, you know, that's got to cover everything. That's got to cover race, ethnicity, disability, etc. So gender and sexual diversity really kind of gets squeezed out. It really gets marginalized. So yes, I think, yeah, I would definitely advocate, obviously, for this being something that is included in teacher training, but actually practically, even that is really difficult to do. It can also, of course, be something that's incorporated into in-service training, you know, teachers' ongoing professional training once they're actually in post. and doing their jobs. But again, you know, time is a factor that teachers struggle with all the time. To be honest, I think there need to be specialised relationships and sex education teachers, trained teachers, which there aren't at the moment. It's teachers of anything kind of do PSHE as well as their other subjects kind of on the side. So yeah, I think there's probably a case to be made for more specialist teachers being trained.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer to the question. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. So,
okay.
So this is where I would like to thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Professor Sauntson, for this inspiring talk. And now we invite you to take part in the break on Gathertown. You can take this break there, and you can. It is an interactive environment. You can join the break there, and we'll resume after a short break with the sessions. So thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.